Good morning readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf and I'm back for another bookish breakfast. It's going to be an attempted short one today because I'm going to work, but I just wanted to talk about Northanger Abbey, which I haven't got out. Here we go, Northanger Abbey. There are going to be spoilers in this video because I'd like to talk about just like impressions of the novel as a whole, I suppose. So I've just finished it. It was the novel that I chose to reread as my reread one of Jane Austen's major novels challenge for Jane Austen July, if that makes any sense. And yeah, again, I have been struck by just how delightful it is as a book. It is the nicest book. Whatever Catherine might say about Udolpho, the nicest book is Northanger Abbey. And I was watching a video yesterday by Rita, who I will link below, probably not in the 5 minutes before I leave for work, but at some point I will link below to this video, where she talks about it being probably the funniest. And I think that's right. There's a particular sense of humour in it that is a lot fresher than the sense of humour that you might find in some of Jane Austen's other writings. But it's still got that kind of like slightly wry attitude sometimes, which is appealing. So there's a nice blending of like the light-hearted with the cynical, I suppose. So the main thing I wanted to talk about is kind of the idea of storytelling in Northanger Abbey and the way that it is told as a story, alongside the role that stories have within it. And I'm going to try and do that in 10 minutes and say something interesting. That is going to be challenging, so I'm sorry if it doesn't come out very good. So basically, I couldn't help but notice, well, anyone who reads Northanger Abbey can't help but notice that there is a very particular role to the narrator in it. And we talk about Jane Austen as being like one of the pioneers of free and direct discourse, where the narrative can move in and out of the characters' heads, and also have this kind of omniscient perspective in a very like natural and fluid way. But the narrator in Northanger Abbey is much more of a fixed character. And John Marlon talks about this a little bit in What Matters in Jane Austen, but I think he really neglects Northanger Abbey throughout the whole of his book, but particularly in the chapter about the narrator, because he talks about the instances where the narrator addresses us directly, as though they're quite rare and unusual, and there are only a couple of occasions when Jane Austen actually uses the word like I leave it to my reader to determine, or something like that. But throughout the book, almost in every chapter, she is constantly talking to us a little bit aside, as though she's like our confidential friend who is narrating a little story that she knows that's our kind of mutual acquaintances, or something. You get this very much, this idea that she's almost gossiping from the privileged position of somebody who is able to know Catherine's intimate thoughts, as well as able to see them sort of from a distance and give you a little bit of perspective on them. So the way that works is, I was talking about her being this kind of confidential friend. She really treats her characters as though they are real when she's talking about them. For instance, she talks about how happy everyone is that Miss Tilney is getting married at the end, or she just acts as though they are real people and real characters. And the kind of telling approach that she takes is quite similar to the style that you get in like the works that she's mimicking, like The Mysteries of Udolpho. Anne Radcliffe is all about like telling rather than showing, but the way that Jane Austen tells, like, they're both telling us about their heroines and telling us about the emotions that they're experiencing and telling us about the events that are happening, rather than maybe a more modern style, which would be to kind of like hint about it more. But Jane Austen is telling it as a joke most of the time, and she's always just kind of undermining the things that she's saying and making tiny little comments about it that show us that we shouldn't take this too seriously, and we shouldn't take Catherine too seriously, and we shouldn't take her too seriously as the narrator. So yeah, I found that quite interesting. This edition has got a little afterword, and I'm going to see if I can see who it's by. I forgot to note it down. Oh, it doesn't. An afterword by David Pinching, and he kind of comments on that role of the narrator, and he talks about the fact that it really seems like Jane Austen loves writing the more gothic bits. Like, she loves writing the bit where Catherine thinks that she's found this gothic manuscript, and she loves writing like Henry's gothic tale that I'm going to mention again in a minute. But she also loves like breaking that down afterwards. It's like she likes to set it up, and she likes to indulge in that kind of dramatic, suspenseful writing, and she likes to kind of try her skill at that, I suppose, and kind of see whether she can trick us with it. And then, yeah, likes to kind of unfold it the next day to kind of like heighten the joke, I suppose. Yeah, so that's kind of like the role of the narrator. But once you've noticed the role of the narrator and the way that the narrator tells this story, which is very much almost like keeping it at arm's length and getting into the characters' minds, but commenting on them. The other thing that I was going to say is maybe the reason why the narrator doesn't spend very much time in Catherine's mind is that the narrator is too clever for Catherine's mind. Like, Catherine is a brilliant heroine and I love her very much, but she's not the most intelligent of Jane Austen's heroines. She is definitely good-natured, affectionate, pleasing, generally lovely, but she's either not very bright or she doesn't use her brightness in the appropriate way. So having that distance that the narrator has allows the narrator to tell a cleverer story than Catherine perhaps is appreciating and experiencing, which is a technique that is not often used by other authors of the time, because they tended to tell us or try to make us believe that their heroines were incredibly intelligent and, you know, like wonderfully accomplished and incredibly well read and fluent in 50,000 languages. Whereas Jane Austen's kind of saying, you know, Catherine's a little bit basic, but I'm going to tell you the rest of the story as well, even without telling it plainly. Yeah, so the other thing that I was going to comment on, was the role that stories play when being told by other characters in Northanger Abbey. So a lot of characters in this story tell stories themselves. One brilliant example is Mrs. Allen. You might not have noticed, but every time Mrs. Allen gets into a conversation with somebody, she starts telling a story, and it is always the most boring, trivial story that you could imagine. And it's normally something to do with how she got hold of a certain dress, or how far it is to Salisbury, and something that Mr. Allen said the other day, and it's really dull. And I suppose Mrs. Allen's stories represent the mundane and the world that Catherine is trying to escape from. This is the kind of story that she's been exposed to all her life in Fullerton, and that's why she wants something more. She doesn't want to just hear about, you know, like how far it is to Salisbury. She wants to indulge in something a little bit richer and a little bit more adventurous. So she starts listening to other characters who tell her stories. So the words. Sorry, trying to find my next point. The Thorpe siblings, that's what I was looking for. So the Thorpe siblings both tell Catherine stories, and she believes both of them. They have quite a different style, but both of them tell stories that are exaggerated, self-descriptive, and very much calculated to deceive Catherine. So, for instance, Miss Thorpe, Isabella, is constantly telling stories about how she's such a loyal friend and so faithful, and so generally just talking herself up in a particular way. And Catherine is completely taken in by Isabella's stories. So Isabella always says that she places such a high value on constancy or whatever, and then Catherine is like, oh, well, but Isabella really values constancy, so I don't understand why she would have been inconstant. Because she's believed what Isabella has said rather than looking at what she has done. Meanwhile, John Thorpe is constantly telling stories about, you know, how brilliant he is with his horses, and, you know, what money he's gained through various transactions, and he even tells stories that directly contradict each other. When he's talking about Morland's carriage, and he's like, oh, I wouldn't ride in that for £50, and then he's like, oh, I would ride that 500 miles for £50. And Catherine believes both of these stories and is just sat there incredibly confused because she doesn't know how to reconcile these lies, because she's used to dealing with Mrs. Allen, who it would never occur to her to make something up. So basically what I'm saying is Catherine is incredibly credulous, but Catherine's credulity is beautifully mirrored by General Tilney's credulity. So Thorpe comes up to him as well, and he lies to him as well, and General Tilney also believes John Thorpe. And I find it interesting that the way that both of the characters are persuaded to believe unreal events in the story is spoken about in similar terms. So after John Thorpe has confused Catherine, she obviously goes off to Northanger Abbey, and on her way there, Henry Tilney tells her this beautiful Gothic story about the dramatic events that might happen to her when she is in the Abbey, and he happens to mention an ebony and gold case that she's going to find in her room. She goes into her room, and she does find not exactly an ebony and gold cabinet, but a Japan cabinet, so it's black and yellow, and she's so caught up in the similarity of this description to what Henry Tilney was mentioning, that she kind of accepts that it must be, like, there must be a link somewhere there, and that this must be a cabinet that is going to have some kind of Gothic implications to it. So she tells herself a story based on that. And then she later comes to tell herself a story based on even more far-fetched connections. And she says something along the lines of that her belief in this story that she has created for herself is supported by such appearances as to make their dismissal impossible. And it's very similar what is said about General Tilney when he is coming to believe John Thorpe, which is that it doesn't occur to him to doubt this information that he's being given, because to the things that Thorpe has said were added the absolute facts of such and such. And we as the reader can see in both of those cases that the appearances that they're talking about and the facts that they're talking about are not sufficient to back up what they have been led to believe. Both of these characters then have their illusions ripped up and taken down, but the effect on them is quite different. So Catherine is made by Henry to disbelieve the fiction that she has created about General Tilney, and it affects her credulity as the novel goes forward. So instead of now believing everything that she hears and everything that she imagines, the next thing that she is asked to believe is Isabella Thorpe asks her to believe that there was a misunderstanding and she does love Catherine's brother and she does want to continue the engagement. Catherine does not believe that. When General Tilney's ideas about Catherine are destroyed, he immediately jumps into another inappropriate belief and goes from believing that she's a rich heiress to believing that she's completely indigent and penniless and that she must be like a gold digger, essentially. So Catherine learns from her mistakes, basically, and General Tilney doesn't. Yeah, and I just found all that pretty interesting. There was one other thing that I wanted to mention in terms of the structure of Northanger Abbey, which is the use of a false engagement to try to make an excuse. So towards the beginning of Northanger Abbey, Catherine wants to go for a walk with Miss Tilney, but her friends want her to come out in the carriages with them. So John Thorpe invents the idea of a prior engagement, goes up to Miss Tilney and says, oh, she can't possibly come walking with you because she's remembered that she has this prior engagement, and he goes off. And Catherine, when she finds out that he's done that, runs after Henry Tilney to explain that this isn't the case. Then at the end of the book, General Tilney invents an excuse and invents a prior engagement that he says has occurred to get rid of Catherine out of his house, and Henry Tilney is the one that then has to run after Catherine to clarify that that is not the case. So yeah, I just really like the mirroring in the structure there. I've never noticed it before somehow, but the way that both of them do something very rude and very improper when they both bad characters, John Thorpe and General Tilney, do something very improper when they invent this idea of a prior engagement, and both the good characters then have to contradict them by going out of their way to run after the other characters to explain themselves. So I thought that was a very beautiful like narrative feature that somehow I've not noticed it before. I'm sure everyone else has. The other thing, just very briefly, John Marlon talks about the use of first names in Jane Austen's books, but in Northanger Abbey he refers to the fact that Catherine never calls Eleanor Tilney by her name Eleanor until the point when General Tilney is kicking her out of the house. That is the night where suddenly her friendship with Eleanor has reached such a point that she is able to address her as my dear Eleanor, and then the whole of the rest of that scene they're saying to each other, my dear Eleanor, my dear Catherine, my dear Eleanor, my dear Catherine, and it really strengthens this idea that they are brought together by this adversity. But while I was reading it I couldn't help noticing that Catherine is referring to Eleanor on first name terms in her head from at least when she arrives at Northanger. So, well, the narrator is referring to Eleanor and Henry consistently as Eleanor and Henry from the point when they arrive at Northanger Abbey. And I think in this instance, although I've said that the narrator is maybe slightly distant from Catherine, in this instance, I think the narrator is taking the lead from Catherine's mind. Catherine is already thinking of them as Eleanor and Henry because she already sees them as her family. So I think that's like a nice little hint as to the way that Catherine's feelings are tending, which we obviously know, but also maybe to how it just sets the three of them up as a little grouping, because it's always Catherine and Eleanor and Henry, if that makes any sense. So anyway, thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed it or found it remotely interesting, and let me know your thoughts about Northanger Abbey in the description, whether you're reading it this year again for Jane Austen July, or whether you've recently read it, or anything at all really. And happy reading, and I will speak to you soon.